So, the last part of this unit about the heritage of independence, we're going to be looking at the Haitian Revolution, which is a very interesting case study with respect to the impact of independence and revolution throughout the Americas. First thing we need to know is what was or where is Haiti? And so, if you look at the location of Haiti around the 18th century, so the late 1700s, early 1800s, Haiti is this island that is in the Caribbean, which, if you look closer here, which was divided into two sections. The blue side here is the French territory, which would eventually become Haiti. As you can see on the map here, it is referred to as San Domingo. The yellow part here would be the Spanish-held territory, which would today be the Dominican Republic. During the 1700s, the West Indies of San Domingo was a very, very wealthy colony for France and Spain. And if you remember from what we've talked about already, the relationship between France and Spain in the 1700s into the 1800s becomes very close because of Napoleon's role in taking over the Iberian Peninsula in Spain, which then, as we've already looked at, created this tremendous movement in independence when Joseph is putting the monarchy in Spain. Well, Saint Domingue is very interesting because as this richest colony, it was definitely a prized possession of Napoleon because it created a tremendous amount of wealth because it was this strictly slave-based economy in the production of sugar plantations. And the sugar of the late 1700s was pretty much one of the greatest exports to the wealthiest people around the world. It was highly sought after and as a result made Haiti a very prized possession. Now, there's a lot of other things that are going on in the world at this time, like, basically Napoleon wanted to take over Europe. And we're dealing also with like how France and Britain and then eventually France and the Americans are kind of conflicted over this possession of North America. So Haiti becomes this very unique independence movement where the slave classes start to rebel against the French controlled territory. So to get a better understanding of this, we really have to start looking at what the caste system was in Haiti, because like every other independence movement, we've really made this a priority in understanding ultimately like what was the breakdown of society and how did these caste systems kind of organize themselves to overthrow the powerful elite. So first is to understand what that first caste was or what the controlling elite was. And it was actually divided into, unlike a lot of South America, this elite class that was primarily based off of control of the land. So the highest class was not like your peninsulares, so not your people who were born in the European continent, but they were typically the planters or the owners of the plantations who were referred to as the Grand Blancs. They were similar to those affluent Creoles who then, kind of are trying to get the power away from the peninsulares and, ultimately were the ones who controlled the trade system and the maritime wealth. They were kind of a divided class of then the working class whites who were referred to as the Petite Blancs. And they were not necessarily land owning, but they did a lot of the managerial work of these wealthy white Grand Blancs. And so within that group, you have kind of this breakdown of a desire for power. And you don't really see a similar breakdown like this. You can kind of equate it to the difference between the Patriots and the Loyalists in North America. You can kind of compare it to some parts of South America with the division between the Creole groups, particularly with the southern states, with like San Martin trying to kind of gain control of South America with the rising up of those lower African American and Native castes. The Grand Blancs and the Petite Blancs, however, kind of go back and forth with each other and ultimately kind of end up as one group. The interesting part of Haiti, though, is where the second and third castes fit in. And so this is made up of two separate castes, the second of which were mulatto and freed slaves, of which there were plenty in Haiti. They had received full citizenship, but they didn't have any political rights. And so they faced a lot of social discriminations. However, they were able to become very wealthy, and some of them owned their own plantation, their own businesses, and had a very interesting role, because in some respects they even had more power socially and economically than the Petit Bloc. And that's where you get a lot of this division between the mulatto and freed slaves group and the Petit Bloc. And so that's kind of an interesting aspect of the Haitian Revolution, which in many respects made it very brutal, and particularly because of the way that freed slaves managed to engage the slave caste. And so the slave caste obviously were the slaves living in Santo Domingo or Haiti. There were over 500,000 of them by 1791, and they were part of one of the most brutal slave systems in the entire world, particularly because the political system itself was so separated from where they were, where France was dictating kind of the government of Haiti, and what was actually happening in Haiti was really dictated by the social norms. And also just because there wasn't a lot of diversity in the way that their economy was made up. It was slave-based primarily. And because of that brutality, they're created out of this a slave population that ran away, many of which went into the mountain ranges within the division or the middle center part of Haiti, between Haiti and Saint-Domingue, which created an opportunity for a population that could be very easily organized and grouped to lead a revolution. And that's primarily where that revolution came. It was from freed slaves who went and engaged with these maroon communities and started to attack a lot of the different slave plantations throughout Haiti. The person who led those things, those movements, is Toussaint Louverture. He was an escaped slave who lived among the maroon communities. So these were the communities of runaway slaves who headed their way into the internal part of the island of Haiti. And this is kind of a thing to note about Haiti, of what makes it such a unique situation as far as the slave revolution, is that, you have a very closed geographical area. Now, Haiti is very large. It's not small per se, but it's much smaller than if you were to look at the entire part of the southeastern United States or any other kind of larger land area throughout South and Central America. Well, by 1800, he became the leader of the most or the only successful revolution led by slaves in what is referred to as the Haitian Revolution. And he actually becomes the leader of Haiti in 1800. However, it is short-lived. Napoleon, recognizing the need to control that area, actually sent an army to retake control. It wasn't easy, because Haiti is not an easy place to fight a war. It is very mountainous, and it's very difficult to get around once you land your ships there. But he was able, in a lot of ways, by kind of playing against different sides of the groups of freed slaves and the maroon caste, to kind of play against each other and actually capture Louverture, who was actually taken back to France and eventually died in prison. So the Haitian independence was very significant. It was a very bloody revolution. Slaves massacred whites wherever they could. In fact, there was a tremendous amount of violence that occurred in this about 3 to 4 year war that happened. It became a very enduring nightmare to people who were slaveholders. And in fact, a lot of the information from this independence movement was very closely prevented from entering into media and propaganda that was happening in the United States. In fact, there's some pretty interesting primary sources available about Thomas Jefferson making a very significant effort to prevent a lot of the news of this revolution from spreading throughout the Americas, especially in the U.S. South. And despite the fact that around this time period in 1804, the French were extremely powerful, much like what happened with the Louisiana Purchase, Napoleon, in very much need of money in his trek to kind of take over all of Europe, decides to kind of, give up on the control of Haiti. And actually it becomes the only successful slave revolt in history. And so we're going to talk and look at a little bit more in depth at this case study of Haitian independence, trying to examine really kind of how it plays a role in the heritage of independence movements throughout the Americas.